Hi everyone, this is my attempt to have a minimal overview of Durkheim's elementary forms in religious life. And I will say, like, dang electricity for taking this class away from us in person, because I think it would have been great. But I also know that nobody wants to watch very long videos, and so I will try my best to summarize, and then maybe we can circle back around to talking about some of these concepts and ideas in class together on Monday, because I imagine we will have electricity then. So in terms of thinking about this, I mentioned it is my absolute favorite Durkheim. Like, it is, and I will try to get through some of these quotes as I'm pulling some of them for you without choking up, but this is just, it's the best. It is Durkheim's love letter to society and humanity, and it is fantastic. So in terms of thinking about the overview, he's trying to explain morality, not religion, right? So it is more about a belief structure than necessarily faith, right? And so at least how we think about it. And his main claim is that religion celebrates the social, and it is not a celebration of the supernatural. In fact, it's not really much to do with the supernatural. The only thing that makes it even feel supernatural is that the social is so amazing, and I'm going to keep using the word like awesome, and I really mean like inspiring awe, right? But the social is so awesome that like we can't understand it in any other way. He also wants to show us that social life is inherently religious. So religion is not necessarily churchy, right? But it isn't in any way, but it is instead it is a practice of rituals and symbols in a community of believers. And I'll probably put up a second video, although also be talking through this one about like secular religions as well and what he might mean by that. So he kind of says that what religion effectively is this community that holds beliefs and rights, right, or practice. And the other main thing he wants to do in this article, or sorry, in this excerpt, is talk about the difference between the sacred and the profane. And so the sacred, in Durkheimian context, this is the extraordinary, everything that is set apart above and beyond the everyday world. So things that are fantastical. And the profane is the mundane, the routine, the everyday. In Marxist terms, Durkheim believes that these exist as a dialectic. And I was thinking about this when I was putting this class together this summer and rereading. I was thinking I happened to be on a trip, and I think you can possibly call it a vacation, although I have a wise friend that always says with children, there are no vacations, only trips, right? Because there you just go somewhere else and go through it. But this trip happened to be very long because I also had some other things that I had to take care of at home at the same time. And it just like kind of slipped away, in part because what makes a vacation special is that escape from the routine, right? It is that idea that like, hey, I don't have to get up and I don't have to go to work and and I can go visit things and eat on a different schedule and whatever, right? But this trip happened to be, almost a month over the summer, and it lost that separation from the profane, right? And to the point that like it was just kind of like vacation was now this thing that we were doing, and without that juxtaposition of it from the everyday, it lost specialness, right? So my husband and I very concretely concluded that and again, this comes from a place of privilege, so roll your eyes if you want, right? But that like we are not meant to take vacations probably longer than a week or two, right? You need that separation. You need to come back, tie into the normal, and then escape it, right? Again. So in terms of thinking about the elementary forms of religious life, Durkheim starts us on page 134 by saying religious phenomena are naturally arranged in two fundamental categories: beliefs and rights. The first, beliefs, are states of opinion and consist in representations, and the second, determined modes of actions. Between the two classes of facts, there's all the difference that separates them from action, right? And so again, Durkheim, like, gotta love his definitions, right? He's like, hey, it's been a while, let me define something for you whenever he's writing. And so, you've got these like shared beliefs, right? That is one important part of religion. But then there is also this action, this ritual, right? And, in terms of thinking about like coming back together on campus, like we went to convocation. I don't know if you do, because I know it's mainly for newer students, but just that like ritual of like the ringing of the bell and the clapping of the faculty and everyone getting together on lower campus, right? Like it sets the tone of like, hey, this is us. We're doing this together. This is our community, right? And that would be kind of something that Durkheim would see as a secular religion, right? So we have these beliefs about valuing higher education, what it means to be a Lutheran higher education, blah, 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 right? Like all these kinds of things, communities of learners. And then you put in with that a bunch of rituals like convocation, like graduation, like dead week, even, right? Finals, all these kinds of things that we experience together, that then solidifies the community so that we come together to kind of to see this. For the sake of shortening this video, I'll probably go through some of Durkheim's examples about the comparative aspects of religion, but do know that that's kind of the science he's doing here. So on Monday when we met, we talked a lot about how Durkheim viewed to do science. We talked all about like empirical positivistic Durkheim, right? And this is more comparativist Durkheim. He's like, yeah, you know, like remember all my cousins that are anthropologists and like my studies there? Yeah, like I did that, right? And so we have these like Australian groups that we want to connect to, and we have these indigenous groups that we want to connect to, and we have the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, and you know, blah blah. And so kind of like doing this, although primarily making this connection between more kind of indigenous faith, right, and more like institutionalized faith, right, traditions. So when he talks about these groups, he says they're unified. On page 135, column 1, all known religious beliefs, whether simple or complex, present one common characteristic. They presuppose a classification of all things, real and ideal, of which men think into two classes or opposed groups, generally designed by two distinct terms, which are translated well enough by the words sacred and profane. After a break, he continues 135. But by sacred things, one must not understand simply those personal beliefs which are called gods or spirits. A rock, a spring, a tree, a pebble, a piece of wood, a house. In a word, anything can be sacred. Anything can be sacred. A right can have this character too, in fact. The right does not exist which does not have it to a certain degree. There are words, expressions, formula that cannot be pronounced only by the mouths of consecrated person. These are the gestures and movements which everybody cannot perform. And so, like, you know, if we were together, so you can pause this video and think about it, like, what are some examples of those things? What are some examples of things that, like, at their root may just be a rock or a piece of paper or whatever, right, that we transform into being sacred? And what kinds of things do we, you know, kind of like help through kind of community understanding as being only some people's place or other people's place, right? I think about like, you know, so like in this example that I'm using of convocation, there's like flags and maces and like MAC, like the medieval, you know, whatever, stick mace thing, all these kinds of things that like we carry into the regalia, right? And it seems problematic to put somebody else doing that, right? Like I remember very much when the person, Professor Norris Peterson retired, who always carried the mace into convocation. When he retired, it became like a big deal about who would do that, right? Because he was the person who did that. And, you know, kind of just suggesting other people, like, really, like, is that person special enough, right? And part of why Norris, if you didn't know him, which I think he probably retired before any of your times, but you know, he was an alum of PLU. He came back and was a professor, right? I mean, like he had this like really strongly rich understanding of the institution, you know, and this deep love for PLU, which made him like appropriate as the mace carrier. And so, you know, and this also kind of starts underwriting this point that Durkheim will just hammer time and time again, that ultimately this religion is about community, right? Because all of these things are about classifying people and things and groups into people that value this thing or don't, right? People who, you know, identify these events, these rituals as special or not. And so effectively, like what religion also is separating believers from non-believers, right? It's making community, which for Durkheim, he is looking at that as social, right? Like, and yes, to mirror on our conversation from Monday, that can certainly get pathological, right? And we can think about times where divisions created by religion end up in a place of pathology or severe problem, right? But just the idea that there is this connection and this separation. I mean, because there is no community unless there is another, right? That is another thing of dialectic, right? Like, who are we together if it's not this other group, right? Like, we have to define ourselves against other people to see that there's anything special about ourselves. He also wants to talk a lot about what in sociology we would call the micro-macro flow. So this idea that things both go up, bottom up and then top down at the same time. Because the dependence on, he talks about like basically like kings who are viewed as superior, but they're not sacred, right? That they exist within this hierarchy, right? That there are plenty of things, where there is inferiority, superiority, but not necessarily sacredness. And Durkheim says that the sacredness comes, the specialness comes because of the reciprocal dependence on one another. So on page 135, gods also have need of man. Without offerings and sacrifices, they would die, right? And so if there aren't entities that we worship, those entities become useless. And it is way easier for me to think about like secular examples of those, right? There are plenty of people that have had just like massive fandoms, and then their fandoms die and they slip into irrelevance, right? Because they need people to elevate them. And then without the people, right, they're, that's the only way that can exist, that they can become, in Durkheim's word, profoundly differentiated, right, by being radically opposed to one another. So having this like person up here and this, these masses down here. And the sacred and the profane do that too, right? So they not only exist separately, so Durkheim says that that's important, but again, talking about this dialectic, they have, in his words on 136, veritable antagonism. They are hostile and jealous rivals of one another, right? And so we have to think about like the sacred and the profane. They have to have tension, right? Like there has to be something about holy water that makes it special, that makes it not just water, right? To the extent that like they have to exist in this kind of antagonistic relationship with one another, right? Like, how do we know that water isn't holy water or vice versa? Well, because like, think if you got them confused, right? That would be a terrible thing. So, in terms of thinking about that, like the job then is to separate and hold up sacred things so that people cannot touch, the profane cannot touch them with impunity, right? Durkheim says on 136. He later then classifies in this excerpt of the reading, talking about, kind of like what religion is, right? And so it is, he says, kind of these, first of all, it comes in and it separates us into two classes. Two classes which embrace all that exists, but radically excludes the other, right? And so one, you got the people who buy into it all and everything, and then you've got the people that don't. And religion then is also kind of this idea of something else that religion is. It has to be a package of ideas, not just like a singular set of ideas. He goes on to talk a little bit more about like magic and religion, and that's a little bit less important. But to kind of get back to this idea about religion being social, he talks about religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices unite us into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. After a pause on page 138 in column 2, for by showing that the idea of religion is inseparable from that of a church, it makes it clear that religion should be an eminently collective thing, right? And so again, what is religion but collective? So I'll return to this in a second. I'm going to end this video just to break it up for those of you that kind of would prefer having two smaller videos. But I'm going to come back and talk through the origins of these beliefs and the numbered sections of this excerpt in the second part.